I did the whole queue. Z had it all nicely organized and I mangled it. I'm sorry, y'all. We was all gonna be slick and everything, but we're not slick. We are trying to be effective at what we're trying to accomplish today. And we're very delighted to have you here. For joining us for our Making Inclusionary Work Real. For the last 10 years or more, we have been partnering with NeighborWorks America, which is a national provider of technical assistance, training, funding, convening, all across the country. And we've been learning with them, and because of them, the incredible work that their members are doing and they themselves are doing. And the area that we specifically have been working with with over the last few months has been in this area of thinking about racial inclusion and diversity. And we approached them and said, hey, we're interested in learning from what you all are trying to accomplish and how we can incorporate that, not just in how we share it with you all, but how we incorporate it here at PACDC. And they've been tremendously helpful and very honest in that conversation. And one of the most powerful conversations we've had to date, and we've had many, 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 is when Dr. Don Trahan came and spent, I guess, maybe about an hour or so of his time just unpacking for us the work that NeighborWorks was doing internally and externally with its many, many members. And we were blown away. He helped in that hour time reframe so much of the mist, clarifying the mist and reframe the conversation, not separating it from our work, but making it embedded in our work, part of the DNA of our work. And when you really think about the work of community development specifically, it really is about inclusion. It really is about justice. It really is about those things, about changing how we're doing our work, how we're trying to make our neighborhoods better and more effective, but reframing that entirely. And so we were very, very excited when Dr. Trahan said that he'd be willing to come and talk with our full membership and our full concentric circle of friends. And we know that when you walk away from today, you also too will have a better, I'm not going to say understanding, because that's not what he's trying to come up with. He is helping us to rethink or reorganize our thinking, which is a profound and radical approach to thinking about how we do all of our work, not just racial equity work, but all of our work, and of really living up to the promise of our country, right? The promise of democracy, the promise of freedom. As you make strong neighborhoods and make them equitable, you're also making our country, we're making a better democracy, a better America. And with that, we're very, very excited to have you join with us today, and know that we will be working continually with Dr. Trahan's office and our partners at NeighborWorks to figure out how we can bring more of these kinds of conversations and insights to you so that you can continue to do your work well supported and well fed to go out and do the work that you need to be doing. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Trahan with our great, great appreciation. We do ask that if you do have questions, and you may well have many, that you hold off until the end of Dr. Trahan's presentation and put those into the chat. And I'll be working with him and his team to get those questions up to you. If he's not able to answer your question today by the time we leave, he will also put in the chat his email address so that you can address those questions one-on-one. All right, so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Trahan. Thank you.
All right, first and foremost, thank you for that beautiful introduction. I am so honored to be with you on this afternoon to do just what has already been mentioned. I want to reframe the way that we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. In particular, I want to create an awareness of how belonging becomes an element of this work and how we really want to be intentional about embedding it into the DNA of your organizational culture. So what does that mean? It means that we're going to keep it real this afternoon. I'm not going to use all the academic jargon. We're going to keep it real. I'm going to speak to you in a manner in which we're going to elevate your thinking. We're going to challenge the status quo, and we're going to leave this time and space, ideally, with more questions, because you're going to be able to reassess the way in which we are approaching this work. So what I need you to do as we spend this time together is bring an open mind, assume the best of others, maintain confidentiality. Even though we are recording this, I'm going to ask that we maintain confidentiality. Speak your truth responsibly. Embrace the paradox. As I just mentioned, we are going to challenge the status quo of this DE&I work. Commit to non-closure. It is very likely that I will say something on this afternoon that's not going to be able to be packaged in a way that we can tie the knot and put a bow on top of it. So commit to non-closure. Also, if I say something, and I will, that doesn't quite set right with you, lean into that. We want to use that in a way in which we can understand what may be driving my level of uncomfort or discomfort. Then I want you to seek intentional learning, because one of the things I like to always make very clear with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and now the element of belonging, is that there is no end result. Well, Don, what does that mean? There is no destination with this work. We are continuously reassessing and evaluating what makes the most sense so that we can drive change within our respective organizations. That means that even if it seems like, okay, we're moving in the right direction, at any given time, we may have to stop, restart, and keep moving. And the reason that I like to make that very clear as we lean into this last part of actively listening and participating is that when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion and the element of belonging, I am looking at this to a perspective where we're going to approach it as an asset to your work while simultaneously assessing it as a disruption to your work. I'm going to say that again because it's going to be important as I frame things with you on this afternoon that you're using that frame of reference. DE&I and the element of belonging must be viewed as an asset while simultaneously being viewed as a disruption. And in that disruption, I want to introduce you to a concept called tact. If you can write this down really quickly, or obviously you'll have the recording, we want to start to practice tact right away. And what that stands for is talk after careful thinking. Talk after careful thinking. And what it allows us to do is to process, to make sure that we are receiving information in a way in which we can understand before we are quick to respond, which may lead to unintentionally a hostile work environment and or an inability to connect with the communities that we are trying to serve across this country. After we leave this time and space together on this afternoon, you're going to be able to identify different leadership styles. You're going to be able to see the lens through which you approach the world and that of others. And then we're going to be able to understand how to foster an organizational culture that is equitable and inclusive. And I'll repeat again, there is no end result with that process. So as we get to the end of my formal presentation, I want you to think of it in a framework that there's more work to be done. And that's going to be critical as we approach this work this afternoon. So I want to jump right in with an exercise. I'm going to invite at least 3 different people who are willing to do so to volunteer to speak your truth as it pertains to these statements. I'm going to model for you what this means, and then I'm going to show you how it connects to the way in which we show up in the workplace and the way in which we are able to communicate with communities that we serve across this country. So I'm going to model an example. I am Don Trahan Jr. My name is Don. My name is not Donald. I cannot tell you how many times people make an assumption and will write Donald on something even formal. People who look like me are doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs. The country air smells like home. I am a native of Dallas, Texas. My church choir sounds like home. My community is thriving, and being able to do this type of work, empowering leaders all over the world, is what makes me feel powerful. I'm very honored to do the work that I do with NeighborWorks, but I'm also honored to be able to work with organizations across the world, identifying, addressing, and resolving inequities in their business structures. So that's an example, just so you can see my frame of reference and a little bit of how I approach things. So I'm going to ask for 3 volunteers. In our Zoom land, I'm going to ask that you raise your hand so that your picture will come into my view, because I can only see 3 people in my camera view right now. And that way we can acknowledge you accordingly. So we can have 3 volunteers who will practice answering these prompts as it pertains to your experience. We would like to listen accordingly. The floor is open. Okay. You want to jump right in?
Was I the only one?
So far, yes.
Oh man, all right. So I am. Oh man, what's the prompt? We just add. We say we respond to anything.
Whatever it means to you.
I am delighted and happy that we are all here today learning together. My name is Pamela Renee Bridgeforth, but people call me Pam, and I'm totally fine with that. My name is not Pamela, which my uncle used to call me. Please don't call me Pamela. People who look like me are they are the vanguards of American culture. The air smells like office, because I'm in an office and I much prefer to be outside. The sounds also sound like, I hear the ventilation blowing, but I also want to be outside and hearing the street noise and the wind blowing. My community is multifaceted. I have a community of colleagues that I work with that I respect and admire. I have a community of community developers that are tremendously awe-inspiring. I have a community of friends and family who give me strength and power every day. And my community is what makes me feel powerful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Pamela. Kevin.
Hi, Don. I am also happy to be here today. I am strong and I'm creative. My name is Kevin, and people who know me well call me KB. My initials, Kevin Brown. My name is not Kelvin. Relatives in the South used to always call me that when I was younger. It used to bother me. People who look like me are resilient and creative. The fall smells like the holidays to me. And my mom's laugh sounds like home. My community is diverse. I live in Mount Airy, which has pretty much a cross-section of everybody. But I see a lot of gentrification changing that. And I'm facing looking forward to the 6-year anniversary of my Men's Coffee Talk, which is a grassroots think tank that I started, obviously 6 years ago at PEC where I work. Next week we'll be celebrating 6 years, and I feel really proud and powerful of that, to have gotten guys of all walks of life to come together to solve problems that they can implement the solutions for. And it makes me feel powerful because it makes them feel empowered as well. So thank you for this.
Thank you. And then Felina, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes, sorry, my mute button wasn't working. Yes, you are. Thank you, Don. I am Felina. My name is Felina. My name is not honey or baby or girl. It's Felina. People who look like me are often underappreciated, yet they are goddesses walking the earth. I'm just speaking from my mind. The smell of home cooked meal, greens, turkey. Looking forward to that in about 3 weeks. That smells like home to me. The sound of hip hop thumping sounds like home to me. My community is in a period of unrest and struggling right now, but I'm hoping for a better future, hopefully. And what makes me feel powerful is working as a community initiative specialist for the Free Library. And through my work, I am able to engage with my community and encourage members of my community one by one to utilize helpful resources and better ourselves. And I really love the work that I do. It's very fruitful, and I hope to expand upon it. And that's all.
Okay. Thank you so much for all. Oh, all right, Esther, we'll go ahead. And after this, we'll process why we've done this. Esther, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. I am Esther. Oh, that wasn't the first one. I am a white woman, and I'm a Philadelphian. My name is Esther. My name is not Esther my Schwester, which sometimes people like to rhyme with the Yiddish. People who look like me are I don't know, they look like moms. At least to my kids, I just look like a mom. Fall smells like home to me. I love fall. This is my favorite time of year. And a dog barking and kids yelling at each other, and my husband playing the piano. That all sounds like home to me, all at the same time, happening all at the same time. My community includes East Mount Airy, so shout out to Mount Airy, to my neighbor. And I do love it there. That is one of my communities. I also have a Jewish community and a community of people who care about Philadelphia, who work in nonprofit. What makes me feel powerful is when I can let go of my ego and just receive and experience what people have to offer.
Mm-hmm. For being very present. And there's an art to be able to do that in a way in which we can learn from each other in order to have a profound impact in the end. Let me pose a question to the group at large. Why do you think in a talk about making inclusionary work real, why would I waste your time if you think of it in that way? Because it wasn't me being nosy or us being nosy. Why would we spend time doing that? What's the purpose of us gaining insight on how the four of us show up? And no right or wrong answers, but why would we do that?
To highlight differences in people and the way they think.
Okay, why is that important? To highlight differences in the way that people think. Why is that important?
Just to understand that not everybody thinks like you do.
Absolutely. And to put that into context, we all had the same prompts. We all had the same prompts. The way in which we processed and or responded to those prompts varied according to each of our vantage points. How do you believe that may have an impact in the workplace environment? Same prompts, the application or the way in which we process those prompts vary according to each of our vantage points. how does that, or how can that have the potential to impact how we show up in the workplace environment?
I think sometimes workplaces are mission driven, and there's like a team culture that sometimes dilutes the real creativity, the robustness of the group is flattened by team mission from, I guess, the top or however.
Yeah, spot on. That's actually gonna pose this question. And I want you all to really think about this, and that's a great segue to the direction we're getting ready to go. Do you see what I see? The answer is no. Do you see what I see? The answer is no. And what we have to understand is that each of us, we're going to approach everything that we do in a very different way. Even if we happen to have similarities with each other's background, the way in which we're going to approach things will deviate based on what our lived experiences have been, even where we show up in an organization. And to put that into context, we're going to take a look at the language. And I think this is so important when we start to think about the positions that we hold, especially when it comes to visions and missions, because they can be very misleading and it can really influence how people show up and what they do in the workplace environment. So we have, on a surface level, some formal aspects that easily we could address. So our goals, your organizational strategic plan or the strategy, the structure of your leadership, the standards, the processes and procedures, what you're doing. So when we think about the ways in which we are creating and trying to cultivate access to home ownership, and then any type of management, those are things that we can point to on the surface level. We got to be careful with that, because underneath that is the informal component of what we do within our organization. And how each one of us understands that informal component will, in fact, drive how we show up in the workplace. Well, Don, what does that mean? I'm so glad you asked, because I'm going to tell you. When I first start with an organization, we typically are going to have a period of time that someone or a select group of people are going to provide us with an overview or insight of the organization. So you may be shadowing someone, you may be spending some time having meetings with select people, but what's happening along that time is you are developing an understanding of the way things are done in the organization based on whose perception. And I'm gonna repeat that because I wanna make sure you all are with me. As you're shadowing or as you're meeting with a select group of people when you start in an organization, you are learning about the organizational culture based on whose perception.
The person who set up the training.
Say that one more time.
The person who set up the training.
The person who set up the training, so it could be your supervisor, and the supervisor is going to typically select people that they believe are important for you to spend some time with, learning about, asking questions, gaining insight. But in that process, where are you going to then learn how each of the components of the organization? So I'll give you an example. When I first started with NeighborWorks, we were in the office, so pre-COVID, and downstairs on the 8th floor is where my office was located, and it's also where the kitchen is located in the building. And what I would typically do every morning is I would get to the office, go in my office and begin the workday. And I would realize, wow, people kind of not in the office yet. And so I learned by going in the kitchen that even though people would be in the office, one of the first places that they would stop to kind of congregate before the day began was in the kitchen to get coffee or a snack or just to catch up, and then the workday would begin. So I started to learn the culture. I also learned in terms of how to dress. Because when we first started, I was wearing a suit and tie every day, and I realized, whoa, that's kind of not the culture in the office. People do dress up, but not the way that I was dressing up every day. And I learned that from going into those informal spaces. So even though on the surface level, we had all of the formal things in terms of our handbooks and things that we would learn through orientation, but the actual application was modeled for me based on the people that I was engaging and those individuals who my supervisor decided that it was important for me to spend some time working with during my initial few months. That then shaped for me how I came to understand the organizational culture. The reason I want you to pay attention to this is twofold. One, how each person understands this process is going to shape how they show up in the workplace. So even though you may have a vision and a mission, and you may have formal procedures that are set up through HR, that's going to vary based upon who the supervisor is, based upon the years of experience that person has been with the organization, and based upon the vantage point of that leader. So under the informal processes, you start to learn organizational behaviors. You start to learn the politics. Don't say this to this person. Be careful with this person. Watch out for this. You start to also see what's called within group dynamics form within an organization. It's part of the reason that we have seen over time challenges with retention for certain demographics, because you start to learn things within the culture. Overwhelmingly, as already has been mentioned, this component over here, I believe you all can see my cursor. This component over here sets the tone for the organizational culture. So what the leader feels is important, their own image, their own traits, what they're comfortable doing, what they are motivated by, and what they value is what will get reinforced. Well, Don, why is that important? Because if racial equity and or creating access to opportunities for historically marginalized, or we're going to reframe the language, historically intentionally excluded individuals, then we have to be aware of why that may be challenging. As we look at policies and procedures in our industry, we may want to wonder, well, why is it that gentrification is still having such a profound impact? Why is it that redlining to this day in 2021 is still having a profound impact? We are more segregated than ever. Why is it that the racial wealth gap, as it stands, we're looking at approximately 234 years to close that gap? Well, it's the composition of the leadership, and not only within our organizations, but within this country. I share that with you for a frame of reference because we must be aware of how all of these components intersect, because they are not isolated. They intersect to shape and cultivate the organizational culture. So even though we may talk about this stuff over here, this is what's driving our day-to-day activities. It's what's prioritizing what we do, and it is directly influencing how we do our work. You've got to understand that. So I share that with you for a frame of reference because we need to reimagine ready. We need to reapproach this work. If I were to ask you, and I'm going to go out on a whim and say many of you probably have heard about racial equity, that's the new buzzword. How do we make it practical? How do we ensure that it's actually integrated and embedded into what we actually do beyond the numbers? So we could talk about we've met X number of individuals, or we've created X or created access to X number of communities, or we've looked at X number of whatever X is and find that we still lack diversity, find that we still have no equity, find that we are not being inclusive, but actually exclusive, and yet we can talk about racial equity. So we have to reimagine what we're doing in this space. And my challenge to each of us that have gathered on this afternoon is to reassess our business practices so that we have an aligned strategic approach and focus for diversity, equity, and inclusion with an emphasis on equity and inclusion. What is it going to take for us to actually dismantle systems that have been strategically and systematic oppressive. Make sure you're with me, systematic and strategically oppressive, so that we can create access to opportunities and the state of act of being included. In many cases, we have to reassess the way that the room operates because the makeup of the room is going to look a particular way. This is going to access capital. This is going to influence the way in which we do lending. It's going to influence the way in which we look at assessing grants if we are to think about how to actually create equity and inclusion. We want to reimagine this approach. And that's the desired state as we're doing this. That means that we have to take an approach and really assess, why are we doing this? There are three elements that when we're talking about strategic diversity leadership or making this real, we've got to look at, and I know that we're in the nonprofit space, but I'm going to still tell you all three. How can we make money, save money, and optimize our position in our respective markets? And what then comes to mind is that, one, we've got to make sure that we are aligned with our structure, our organizational culture, so that we can look beyond the jargon and actually think about the informal processes that are happening below the iceberg that I just showed you. Then we need to be aligned with the way in which we're playing the game so that we can actually have a return on investment in this space. If you don't have or DE&I is not valued in that way, what you run the risk of is having surface level action items that lead nowhere. Don, what does that mean? You can have a program. So what? You can have employee resource groups. So what? You can put on a community benefit. So what? If it does not connect back to your policies, procedures, and processes internally. That's the way in which we have to make sure we are strategically aligned and that we prioritize what we're doing so that we're moving in the same direction. I return to this mindset, an aligned strategic focus. That means that some things are not going to be able to happen simultaneously. That means that we're going to have to prioritize the work. And that also means that we're going to have to measure what the impact has been with the willingness to take a step back to shift gears or change directions at any given point. But if we are not strategically aligned, moving in the same direction, and having executive commitment and sponsorship or buy-in, then all of this is challenged. So once we are able to solidify where we are with those informal processes, we have to identify what is it that we're looking to move forward with. And I bring to you this element of organizational learning theory. We have to know what our baseline is. What's the that or the this that we're trying to address? Is it racial equity? Is it employee engagement? Is it community development? Is it outreach? What is it that we're trying to do? Once you've identified that, what needs to be prioritized? And how then can we apply a racial equity or an equity, inclusion, and diversity perspective to the work? That then becomes the way in which your organization can learn. And in many cases, you're not going to want to do this shared framework that you make everyone do. You're going to want to be very deliberate with who's learning what based on their baseline. And I'm going to actually challenge you on that to make sure you're not just doing a cookie cutter approach, but instead being very clear about this is where we are, and this is what we need in order to move the needle in the direction that we are aspiring to go. From that, you need to, and I'm not saying should, but you need to make sure that you are assessing along the way. So here's where this data acquisition point comes in. You're able to look at what's our baseline, interpret what that means, and then to identify very specific actions that will drive that change. And this process will happen in a loop. It is not an end result, as I mentioned already, but instead a starting point to continuously reassess. And as you're doing that, it will allow you to understand, how are we moving the needle? Is there something that we need to focus on that maybe we hadn't thought about yet? Is there something that we've learned through our data acquisition and through the interpretation or analysis component that's going to help us to then prioritize another action? That process is ongoing. So in order to better understand that, you must understand, well, what are we talking about when we really get into this space? And I want to share with you, by no means is this an exhaustive list, but it's to give you an idea of any given time what may be presented as it pertains to DE&I, and that sense of belonging. We have primary factors and secondary factors, and as I stated, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's to show you some of the factors that may show up at any given time within your organization, as well as within the communities that you are serving. And each of these interconnected cultural factors will, in fact, influence how your employees show up or how you show up, as we've all modeled with the I am exercise. What I want you to take away from this as we're thinking about how to prioritize ready or how to make sure that we make this practical is that all of this, we've got to be able to look at where we're starting at, because each of us will have a dominant perspective based on our own experience or our own vantage points. And that then can and will reinforce elements of bias, can and will influence elements of bias. Don, what does that mean? It doesn't matter if you're a leader or a supervisor or a manager in the organization, you are biased. It doesn't matter where you sit at in the organization. As an individual contributor, you are biased. And we've got to understand that so that we can then align on where we're going, check our own assumptions and the way in which we're showing up so that we can work towards what we're doing. Believe it or not, I'm going to draw your attention here. One of the leading factors that causes disconnect in the organization is the way in which we communicate. The way in which we communicate. Generational dynamics have had a profound influence and impact on the way in which we communicate. We could be saying the exact same thing, but if we're receiving it in a different way based on the choice of words or the way in which if we understand something, we may be missing each other. And in that moment, it can then reinforce bias. As a millennial, I cannot tell you how many times I have heard people make negative stereotypes and or dismiss the factors of what I bring to a space without regard for the way I'm saying something or why I may be saying something. So instead of making an assumption, it creates an opportunity for us to stop and practice tact. Once again, that's talking after careful thinking. So we've got to reassess that. And I'll say again, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but it's to give you an idea at any given time what may be showing up in the composition of your workplace and your workforce and the communities that you serve. So we've got to be aware of this. We also have to be aware of our style and or approach to leadership. Everyone's going to have a different way of doing it. There is no right way, but we do want to be mindful of the way in which we are leading if we are to gain buy-in to drive change collectively. We want to abandon this mindset of a boss that is dated and instead really understand our approach of leading. And I want to give a personal challenge to each of you as we navigate the space this afternoon to really take a moment to reflect upon what's my approach to transmitting information or communicating things that we want done. And how can I gain buy-in? What am I willing to do differently? I really want to challenge you on that. But we're going to take some time to look at 3 different leadership styles. And this is not an exhaustive list either, but it's elements that I believe are important for us to dissect as we're thinking about how to make this real in your respective organizations. So you're going to notice on these slides, I have put certain things in bold for you and changed the color because I want to draw your attention to what's being communicated as it will influence the way each of these leadership styles operate in an organization. We'll start with transformational leadership. This is the process that changes people through deeper exploration of emotions, values, ethics, and long-term goals. It's taking time to understand what is the baseline, and once I know that baseline, where are we going? Why are we going in that direction? To what extent is it going to influence the bottom line of our organization? And that's going to allow you to then start to frame, how do we get there? You've got to think big picture to understand, how do we get there? This means that through this style, as we're looking at emotions, values, ethics, and long-term goals, the leaders will assess followers' motivation, satisfy their needs, and treat them as a full person. So we've got to look beyond, what the person's role is, and take the time to understand, who are they? And I'll give you an example of something I just posted today on LinkedIn for leaders to take into consideration. I am celebrating my 15th year as a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated today. And I posted on LinkedIn that that's an element of my culture that I bring with me everywhere I go. So it's not just the fact that I'm an African-American man in America, it's this interconnection of all of the factors that contribute to who I am. And if you are to understand me and what motivates me and what drives me, you've got to look beyond what we can physically see in order to understand what's going to motivate and best manage a person. So those are the factors that we want to be mindful of as a transformational leader. These leaders are charismatic and exhibit qualities of being a strong role model, competence, articulation of goals, communication of high expectations, confidence, and the ability to arouse motives. What is it that your employees are interested in? When we start to think about ready, where are people motivated? How do we position them to be able to do that? How can we use them as strategic business partners instead of only focusing on programming that's surface level, or only focusing on affinity-based approaches that do not lead to sustainable business practices and or change? That's the way in which we have to approach it as a leader. And through this process, you will be able to produce effects on followers that lead them towards trust, unquestioning acceptance, obedience, affectionate goal orientation, and confidence. Another way of saying that, they will be able to better carry out what they're doing, which means that your organization will be in a better position to achieve your desired goals and or what you're measuring over the course of your strategic plan. It's one style of leadership. Adaptive leadership focuses on followers and it's oriented towards problem solving and reconciling conflicting values through activities that mobilize, motivate, organize, orient, and focus the attention on others. Here's where, once you understand that baseline, if you have a history of challenging things that have taken place, maladaptive practices, you've got to start there. You've got to start there. Don, why is that the case? Because if you brush things under the rug, using that as an analogy, it doesn't go away. It doesn't go away. And the first time that something shows up that is problematic to your organizational culture is going to resurface because you didn't reconcile the problems that existed within the organization. So we've had a history and a challenge of the community trusting us because of racial things, because of gender dynamics, because of overwhelming bias. We've got to address that. And we've got to sit in that in order to move forward. And an adaptive leader will understand that in order to prioritize this. These leaders assist followers with addressing problems relevant to the prevalent issues at hand. And this is why prioritizing is so critical. One of the leading reasons that diversity efforts fail is because everything is piled on at one time. We want to avoid that and instead prioritize what we're doing and measure that against the course of your strategic plan. That means that everything is not going to happen in year one. And everyone, guess what? That's okay. That's okay. But we've got to prioritize what's happening. Here, The problem-solving process is led by the employees. Position them to have their voices valued, respected, and supported. Not you as a leader making the decision and reinforcing the sense of them being excluded. I cannot tell you how many times I've engaged staff across this country where they will say, yeah, I'm here, but I'm not here. I want you all to think about that. Yeah, I'm here, or I have my butt in a seat, but I'm not here. I'm just this. My voice doesn't matter. Well, they're going to do what they want to do anyway. When we start to hear that type of dialogue, we've got to reassess our approach as leaders. Adaptive leaders are aware of this. Adaptive leadership requires leaders to address technical problems in the workplace that are clearly defined and adaptive challenges which are not easily identified. Once again, this is where prioritizing your approach is going to be critical. And it allows you to make your work practical. And it then gives you the opportunity, once you are assessing where you are or measuring the impact, for you to then shift to one of the other leadership styles as needed. Last leadership approach that I want to focus on, and this is really, I'm a little biased when it comes to culturally responsive leadership, because I believe this is the North Star. This is the goal over time where we're wanting to go. Culturally responsive leaders possess the skills to foster an inclusive environment that addresses the specific needs of all stakeholder groups. Don, what does that mean? It means that we're not only focusing on historically underrepresented and or excluded individuals. It means that all people have a voice that should be valued, respected, and supported. It means that all people want to have a sense of belonging in the work. Each individual contributor in your organization has a voice. And let me just be blunt to put it out there. Even your white male cisgender employees need to be included in this process. DE&I is not only for people of color or other marginalized groups. We are talking about everyone's voice being valued, respected, and supported. Everyone's voice contributing to where we're going. Everyone taking ownership and pride in your organizational culture. And when you're able to approach it in that way, you're able to gain buy-in across the board, and you're able to have more productivity from all members of your organization, which means that, as I mentioned earlier, you're more likely to position yourself in your respective market in a way which is more profound and satisfying, that you're more likely to have retention in that way. Culturally responsive leaders center inclusion. Inclusion is the state or act of being included for all. Equity, the state of act of having access to opportunity, advocacy, and social justice in their leadership practices. And I always like to spend a little time on social justice, because when we're thinking about social justice, we're looking at systematic discriminatory practices that have intentionally excluded individuals, and that could be led or embedded into rules and regulations, laws and processes and procedures. Redlining is a perfect example of our challenge in this industry with social justice. Voting rights is an example of a social justice problem in not only this industry, but at large. And culturally responsive leaders understand the unique interconnection of all of these factors. Culturally responsive leaders create inclusive organizational climates through the following: critical self-reflection of their own leadership behaviors. What am I doing? How am I checking myself? Because I am a part of the problem as well. As a leader on down, I still am an individual contributor. We've got to be willing to roll up our sleeves and step aside to look at our own practices in the process. They also look at the development of culturally responsive staff. What are we doing to invest, going back to organizational learning theory? What's that data acquisition process? What are we interpreting in that? And then what actions are we taking? We've got to pay attention to that. And that means that, as I mentioned earlier, I want to challenge you to go beyond the surface level approach. Be very intentional, be very practical. If we're looking at education, let's deviate away from the traditional unconscious bias, microaggression. Let's make it practical. Don, what does that mean? Let's make it connect to their day-to-day work. Let's make it something that they can connect to because they've dealt with it. That then allows you to make it real for your staff. It gives you a frame of reference to approach things in a way that they can connect to. We culturally responsive leaders also focus on the promotion of culturally responsive work environments, looking at what are we doing to make this place inclusive for all. And then they also focus on active engagement with the community and those from indigenous contexts. So we want to make sure that we are making awareness and driving things in a way in which everyone leave with a sense of belonging. So it's going beyond just being included, but a sense of I belong here. My voice is valued, respected, and supported. And as I stated, I am a little biased, but this is the North Star for me, because if we're able to adapt this style of leadership, we are more likely to have an environment that people want to be a part of. So what does this look like as we move forward? We've got to be able to do a couple of things, one of which, understand that baseline. What's our culture? Got to challenge that right away. What's our culture? Then once we are very clear on this, what is the specific strategy that we're going to identify? And what goals will align with that strategy? So we think about a strategic plan, that's great. But if it's not done in a way in which you have measurable action items, and when I say measurable, I am looking at qualitative and quantitative factors, then we may need to reassess our strategy. But what is the strategy that we are adopting? What specific tactics are we adopting in order to drive change? I'm going to show you a few in just a moment that you may want to consider as you continue to drive this space. And then as you are approaching your ready work, you got to make sure that it has air to breathe. What that stands for is accountability, the appropriate infrastructure, incentives for your individual contributors, because a culturally responsive work environment, everyone is involved in that process. But that then means that everyone has to be able to have something where they are being acknowledged for the work that they're doing. So often, when we're thinking about individual contributors, they're doing this work on top of their day-to-day work. This is not something that's a part of their role. So how can we incentivize it? What can we do? Can we make it a formal part of their percentage of work? And that's something that, as I've partnered with HR over the years, I've looked at how can we get staff, this could be a formal component of their performance evaluation. It's built into what they do. That way they're acknowledged accordingly. And then, do we have the appropriate resources in order to carry this work out? I always like to give an example of one of the roles that I had earlier in my career, because I remember laughing and realizing, okay, they're not serious about this. I had an organization that I worked with years ago. When I started, I kept asking during the interview process, what is going to be my budget? And I was told, oh, you have the resources that you need. You have everything you need. All right, great. To get into the organization, my budget was $15,000. And I remember saying, so you all want me to buy food? And they laughed. I said, no, I'm serious. You are not committed to us driving sustainable change if all I have is $15,000. DE&I has to be viewed as a critical component like every other area within the organization. And that starts with having the appropriate resources to drive change. The other component, as you're looking here, this is just to show you an example of the interconnection of how each department works together. But equity being your cornerstone is what I want to challenge you on. What is going to be necessary to create access to opportunities? This is where that asset and disruption simultaneously intersect. What's going to be required? What's going to have to change? Who's going to have to move aside? Who's not at the table that needs to be at the table? We've got to pay attention to that. So here are some things that I want you to think about in this context. And I've taken it a step further, but it's important that we're understanding it, taking us back to our organizational climate. So the culture is the way in which we start to practice and values and things that we come to learn. The climate is the pulse. This is where we are. Or going back to this slide, this culture, climate is influenced by the culture. So what's our narrative? Do you hear what I hear? Do you see what I see? From a leadership perspective, from a staff, from where you are physically located, state, region, United States, globally. And obviously, most of our work is not going to expand in a global way, but it's important to think about it in that way because it allows you to go beyond what you can see. We've got to think about it in that way. It also then allows us to understand what are some action items that we may want to consider taking in order to have sustainable change within the organization. So I've given you a few examples here: professional development for all staff, management. In many cases, managers and or supervisors don't know how to supervise. They've been promoted because of their years of service, but not necessarily because they know how to appropriately supervise. So we've got to have an awareness of that. Leadership development. Yes, even the C-suite need training. Let me say that again. Yes, even the C-suite needs training. So this is not something that we're only adopting for other staff that may not be in the C-suite or not in a leadership role, but everyone. And then having a learning management system in place that can drive this type of change. So if you're not doing learning such as what we're doing right now, having online resources available or a library that staff have access to, videos that staff have access to, professional development opportunities outside of the organization that staff have access to. That can be cultivated in a learning management system. And it doesn't have to be this very expensive platform. It could literally be a space on your website that staff are directed to be able to have access to educational opportunities. Some of the tactics that I recommend, going back to the previous slide, are research. Got to make sure we're continuing to understand what is the best practices in the industry. Communication tactics. How are we disseminating information? What's the awareness of that information across our staff? Symbolic tactics. Do I see myself in the organization? And that includes magazines that we may have. That includes, as we started our session today, the music that we may play. It means that, do I feel included? Or is it only, are the examples that we're using, is it only things that, I get it, but I can't relate to it. So we want to be aware of that. Accountability. Once we've adopted something, how are we going to make sure that it's going to be carried out? This is taking the strategic plan beyond the strategic plan, putting it as the responsibility of people across the organization, having benchmarks that are outlined so that we can make sure we are assessing where we're going. We've got to build that in. And then we have to have engagement tactics and or specific touch points in order to drive change. These are tactics to make sure that your ready work can breathe and or has air to breathe. And by no means is this an exhaustive list, but it is to give you an idea of what is available to drive change. In the interest of time, I'm going to move through this part quickly. There is the art and the science of diversity and inclusion. And some of that is, as an organization, you being very clear on how you define diversity, how you define inclusion, how you define equity. You've got to have shared definitions. And I'll take us back to the I am exercise. We all had the same prompts, but we witnessed on this afternoon, we all approached it differently. In that same regard, if you were to ask people in your organization how they define these terms, I guarantee you, you're going to get a plethora of different examples. So as an organization, we must have a shared definition for what does this mean for us? What are we committing to as an organization? And this idea of cultural competence, I typically challenge that. I don't personally believe in cultural competence. I believe that we are always elevating our way of thinking to understand that which can be. But we want to engage in cultural sensitivity, which is positioning ourselves to understand various ways of being, various ways of thinking, various ways of existing. And then we want to build it into our assessments. How do we make sure that we have SMART goals that are tied to ready? Is it specific? Is it measurable? Is it realistic? Is it timely? Building that into your performance indicators can be a critical way to make sure this gets done. Ready can be in, and I actually recommend embedded into your decision-making. Ready can be a part of your processes and procedures, but you've got to build it in that way. And then identify specific goals. What are we going to do? Let's not just talk about it, clearly articulate it, and then use those tactics to make sure that you are assessing the goals and or driving the goals accordingly. There's a change management process that will follow this. We've got to make sure that we're assessing what we're doing, or going back to that organizational learning theory component. That data acquisition is a critical part of this process. How is it impacting us? As we've adopted different things, is it working? If it's not working, let's change the process. But we've got to follow a sequence to be able to drive change if we are going to actually change. If not, we run the risk, as I've said now 2 different times, this will make a third, we run the risk of having surface level action items that lead nowhere. We want to avoid that. In the interest of time, I am going to skip this, but it's just to show you that there are things that you can do to make sure you are intentionally being inclusive. I will draw your attention to one that I want to make sure that's very clear. I've already stated this, but I'm going to say it again. All of us are biased. So you have to acknowledge that and manage your own unconscious bias, and in some cases, your own explicit bias, because it can and will show up and influence the way in which you navigate in your organization. If we're committed to creating an organizational culture that is equitable and that values, respects, and supports your staff. If this is what we're committed to, then we've got to reassess how to approach ready. So I'm going to stop there and answer questions that you may have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And if there's a specific slide that anyone would like me to bring back up, I will do so, but I would like to be able to see everyone as I address your questions. So you can feel free to write your question directly in the chat, and or if you'd like to come off mute, I'm more than happy to answer your questions that you have.
Don, I'm gonna ask a question. So when we were first introduced to you, we were just so impressed with the depth of your thinking about this work and the concept of incentivizing the work and really dedicating substantial resources, both in time and in terms of money, because it really is about realigning your work. It's not saying you're replacing your work, it's reimagining, repositioning your work in a much more grounded and much more visceral way. Mm-hmm. So in the work that you do across the country, and you've done this, you know, you've been engaging in training NeighborWorks participants now probably for a while. What are some things that you're seeing in terms of how people, nonprofit community developers, are actually doing the incentivizing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one, I'll use NeighborWorks as an example. NeighborWorks has given spot awards, which is a small, and I know not everyone can do this, but in some cases, supervisors will give their staff small monetary incentives on their check for their participation in Ready-related activities. They have given them time off to do Ready-related work. They have, I know for us, the Spot Award is one of the ways that people I've seen typically recommend. I've seen staff formally get recognized on their performance evaluation for what they're doing for Ready. And it becomes a desired state. Some staff or some managers have even given dedicated time for their staff to do Ready-related work. So it's building in that percentage of 10% of your FTE is dedicated to Ready. And that way you're not doing this on top of. Now, I'll be clear, all managers do this, but this is what some managers are doing or supervisors are doing in order to encourage staff to be able to have that opportunity. I've seen other people really elevate their team members or their staff in order to do other things. So this being involved in Ready related work can lead to promotions. It can lead to them being able to serve in other external capacities on behalf of the organization. I know I've asked some of our Ready volunteers to do something for financial capacity on behalf of Ready, and they're going to get recognized for that. So it's really positioning them for other leadership opportunities, but also incentivizing it. Staff like time off to do things or like being recognized for the work that they've done. And in some cases, it is time consuming. To do this work the right way, it is very time consuming. But those are some of the ways that I have seen it done, even through professional development opportunities, being able to have staff take advantage of things that they may want to explore that's related to Ready. That's something beyond just a traditional access to things, maybe something that you wouldn't have traditionally thought of, and supervisors approving that so that staff can do it. Those are all ways to do it. I want to make clear, I know that sometimes, especially in the nonprofit world, we are limited with the financial resources. So it doesn't always have to be a monetary opportunity or something that's going to cost. But even if, and this is something we've not done quite yet at NeighborWorks, but I have seen it done in other organizations, having recognized or having formal ceremonies that recognize staff. So I've seen people do awards, certificates, plaques to acknowledge staff, and people like to receive gifts that acknowledges what they've done. But that's another way that I've seen this done. But it's the main thing is making sure that people recognize you see what we're doing and not dismiss the time that they're dedicating to the space because it may not be directly aligned with their actual day-to-day work. That's what people, once you do that, they're more likely to be even more empowered in their role and more likely to stay. One of the leading issues that I've found in the D&I space is retention. And we're running into problems where staff are not staying in organizations for a prolonged period of time, which means that you're spending more money on recruitment, which means that you're losing the institutional knowledge every time you're losing staff or having to retrain staff. So if you can create ways in which people feel valued, respected, and supported, are recognized for their efforts, you increase the likelihood of them staying within the organization.
I have a follow-up question to that, but there are other questions in the chat. So we have a question from Esther. Could you please review what you said about making equity a part of the performance evaluation for the employee, which I think you have already. And then there's another question. Dr. Trahan, your presentation reminds me of a quote I heard and love. A great boss is when a complete stranger is invited to a meeting and cannot tell who the boss is. I am fortunate to work in an environment as such. That's from Amelia Price. Amelia is our superstar in Germantown. And then from Otis, Dr. Smith, what are examples of accountability tactics? I think you said that each person must manage his or her own explicit bias. How do we hold them accountable?
Great question. So with that, I always recommend leaders have to lead by example. So if we're buying into something that we are adopted as a part of the organization, to keep it accountable, it's having set touch points where you're making sure that somebody is going to do this. So for example, in our new strategic plan for NeighborWorks, we have identified advancing equity throughout the strategic plan. In that, we've identified under our 4 goals, very specific touch points that will make sure that we are actually committing to advancing equity. And the leadership across the organization is going to be responsible for enforcing what that looks like. Goal 4 is about our organizational culture. So the way in which we're going to create accountability for that is we're having an equity education series. We're having new training for our Ready volunteers, which include our employee advisory committee, as well as our facilitators. And we've identified 3 different external vendors that we will be bringing in to help us drive our Ready work. The reason that that's important is that we recognize I can't do it alone. And we need other external partners to help us drive this, to make sure that what we have identified as strategic initiatives actually is carried out. So we have a goal of working with at least 25% of the network to make sure that these kind of trainings that we're doing right now, we want to expand that across not only the Northeast region, but the Western region, the Southern region, the Midwestern region. And 25%, I want to get it beyond that, but we brought in external partners to help us drive that space. They also are going to help us to reassess our baseline so that we can reprioritize where we are with Ready. So it's not just talking about it, it's doing the work to build in specific touch points where you can measure impact. From a leadership perspective, it's looking at, if we said we're going to accomplish this by this quarter, what are we actually doing to make sure that it's happening? And that's where the intersection of that engagement tactic comes into play, because we want to make sure that we've identified it, but we also want to make sure identified it and who's going to oversee it, and that we've also then identified the specific touch points that will make sure that the work is done. I have seen far too often, we talk about it in strategic plan, we do an organizational climate assessment, and it stays on the shelf. So we want to go beyond that and actually put in place the touch points to carry it out. And this is where we've done a 3-year strategic plan this time around. Literally from year 1 through 3, we've gone backwards to identify what must be accomplished by which time frame and which quarter to carry out what we've identified as an organization. And what this is going to do, we built that back into the corporate scorecard. I'm going to continue working with our SLT, or senior leadership team, to build it into their divisional scorecard. That way it's actually getting measured, and we at the end can not only measure Ready's impact, but our NeighborWorks at large commitment to advancing equity.
So that what you just said actually speaks to a little bit about what my follow-up question was in regard to the earlier question that I had. So one of the challenges that I know as we were facing, and I really need to speak my own truth, right? So in our organization at PA-CDC, our Ready work is being inculcated. We're trying to inculcate it across our policy and advocacy work, across our member services, as part of our engagement with our members. The challenge that I personally have was, and still I'm still grappling with this, is, many of the team members that I work with in our member services team look like me. But there are members who are other team members that don't look like me. And what I was fearful of was that our Ready work would be the work of people of color. And I would love for you to speak on that piece. You touched on it, in terms of, the accountability, right? There are measurable goals that have been set and inculcated across the organization. And you can access that some way. But the actual day-to-day work of the Ready work, we don't want to be the sojourner truths of our organizations, people of color, doing the kind of day-to-day of it. But then, other folks are not also at that table. I'm sorry if I'm talking in circles, but I just feel like I need to get that out, because what I don't want to see happen is that people say, oh, well, we'll just give our new, young, talented African-American people the work of Ready, and then not give them any access to any influence or power or accountability to actually see it implemented.
Yeah, so this is where the slide that I had that talked about the dimensions of diversity, this is where we need to be clear about what are we talking about. And we want to acknowledge that racial equity is still a prominent problem in this country, but it's not the only element of Ready work. And this is part of the reason why with NeighborWorks, I am not getting rid of the R, but I have emphasized the E and the I. And literally in the language that we're using now, I emphasize equity and inclusion. And the reason for that is we've got to be able to understand, well, where is the gap with access to opportunity? And that's not limited to race. That then opens the door for gender, sexual orientation, religion. I'll give you an example because today, for example, normally we will be having a courageous conversation at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, but we canceled it. Why? Because we want to recognize other religious-based holidays or cultural elements that go beyond the traditional ones that we may think of because of people who look like me. We also are looking at elements of geographical location. What are the specific needs across the corporation? We partner with HR to look at, especially in the wake of COVID, understanding everything else that's needed so that we can really, really be clear about the what's beyond Washington, D.C., just to put it bluntly, because that's where the corporate office is. Well, what about everyone else? So Ready Work has to go beyond looking at racial dynamics and instead understanding the composition of everything that can and will influence your organizational culture so that then staff are more likely to be able to look at ways in which they can contribute. I'll give you an example of one of right now, the only formal employee resource group that we have in place looking at raising conscious children. That's a group where people who have children and or don't have children but want to talk about it come together, and they're having critical dialogue about ways in which to inform their children. That is a way in which to bring them together, and it's driving Ready, but it's doing it in a different way. And it's not just people who are people of color, it's all staff that can contribute to having a conscious awareness. And the undertone of it is Ready. We also are looking at bringing in, as soon as we finish with our organizational climate assessment, what we're calling employee pods. And what that's going to be is it's going to serve as a way in which to have engagement for all staff, but with the focus on everyday things that staff desire, such as looking at reality TV shows that staff may happen to like, but they all are watching it where it can create dialogue or understanding, or creating other, just if you think about it in a social way, but it's doing something that's driving Ready for all staff just in a different way. I think what we have to be careful with so that the onus is not only on people of color is at the beginning calling that out very clearly, that here's what, recognizing the importance of race, but then looking at other ways in which you can think about, well, what do we have in our organization or things that we may not have thought about that can contribute to where we're going? And that's the way that you elevate or shift the narrative to not solely focusing on it from a racial element. That also, just being clear, that is also how you will gain buy-in and help educate staff who believe that this is only something, because what typically happens is people think it's something for Black people. And I can't tell you how often that happens. And we have to shift the mindset to understand this goes well beyond one demographic. But that's part of educating everyone on what we're talking about. This is also where, going back to what I mentioned about making money, saving money, and optimizing your position in the market, it allows you to look at individual contributors as a business strategist in your organization. That elevates the conversation with Ready as well. But you've got to help people see in your various divisions, scope or outreach within your organization, here is how you can contribute to it. And Ready just becomes a framework to understand the decision that you're trying to make or areas that you're trying to assess within the organization. That's the way we raise the profile with what we're doing, while still recognizing gaps in employment in terms of racial dynamics, but also gender.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. This is excellent food for thought. I was taking copious notes, and I know people on this call will want to get copies of the slide presentation to help refresh their memory. This is a part of a journey, folks, right? If you thought you were going to get like, oh, how I can make my organization diverse in 45 minutes or less, sorry, we didn't get that for you. But you have access to some really good baseline information to begin the conversation in a way that's meaningful and honest for the work that you're trying to accomplish. You have access to now some powerful voices and connections at NeighborWorks, Don and the many other really wonderful people that work there. And you certainly have access to PACDC. And we'll be following Dr. Traherne's work. We'll be trying to figure out ways in which to bring him back and his colleagues back to help us further our learning. And we hope that you maintain your, keep a lookout in your email boxes, and also follow us on www.pacdc.org to find out what our next upcoming sessions will be, because we hope to, reintroduce some of this key work again. And we encourage you all to stand firm in what Dr. Traherne was really trying to convey, that this is a process that's going to take us a long time to get to where we want to go. But when you think about the places where we want to go, it's extraordinary. When I think about if we were even halfway lucky to get to where we want to be, can you imagine what this country could look like? Can you imagine what your organization would look like in terms of strength and capacity and resiliency? That's extraordinary. And that work is going to take time, but we have full confidence that you have the ability to do that. And PACDC will be with you every step of the way. So thank you very much for joining us. Please make sure, I think we have everybody's email information from your registration and login. We'll be following up with you shortly. And Dr. Trahan, thank you so much again. Thank you, Susan Jouar from NeighborWorks America. Thank you, Christopher Helmers from NeighborWorks Association, also for their great work in facilitating bringing Dr. Trahan to us today. And thank you again, everyone who registered and committed their time and resources to be with us.